Great to see you.
Good to see
I
you.
think Dr. Sanalisis is just about to hop on as well. So, then we'll get going. Okay. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to have a great discussion about the future of public schools and public education. If you are not a panelist, please keep yourself muted. You can speak in the comments. I'm happy to in the chat box. You can certainly share questions and comments in the chat box. But otherwise, we want to make sure that folks can see the panelists. So I just ask that you keep yourself muted and your video off. Thank you so much for joining us. A huge thank you to our panelists. And I'm Delegate Brooke Learman, and I represent, along with my teammates, Senator Bill Ferguson, Robin Lewis, and Delegates Robin Lewis and Luke Klippinger, the 46th District in Baltimore City. Although we work at a state level to pass and implement policies, of course, that affect the entire state. And I think if there's one thing that this pandemic has really done, besides cause so much unnecessary suffering and death, it's also really crystallized the pre-existing inequities that exist in our society and the lack of resiliency in our communities and state government institutions and families, small businesses and nonprofits. And it's certainly shown that, and it's been very evident in our schools and our public education, from the digital divide to the needs for children with special education for children with special needs and more. So I'm just going to talk for very briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. King and then Dr. Sanalisis, and then we're going to go through some of the questions after they speak for a little bit. We're going to go through some of the questions that folks emailed in when they RSVP'd, and if we have time, we'll get to some of the other questions in the chat box as well. You know, I've held a series of these online briefings since coming home from the truncated General Assembly session, really running the range on topics for how to apply for benefits to supporting our frontline workers and closing the digital divide. And this webinar is one of 3 that we're going to do on public education this month. We're starting with Dr. King and Dr. Sanalisis. Next week, we'll hear from our teachers unions. And we're gonna end the month hearing from Dr. Perman, Dr. Wilson, and other leaders, Dr. Rabowski, and other leaders in higher education about what's next for higher education and public education. Now, why a webinar on reopening of schools and on the future of public education? I haven't been part of a conversation with my friends or constituents in the past week or month or 3 months, really, since school ended, on what is next for public schools. I think parents are concerned, teachers are concerned, employers, you know, will their employees' children have a place to go back to school? You know, what is the plan? And I think we all recognize that this is the future, right? You can't make up a year of kindergarten, right? Like if a 5-year-old misses kindergarten, will that stay with him or her for life? You know, we are all very concerned about the achievement gap that we already have and know is so unacceptably large in Maryland. And we know that this is exacerbating it. So today, you know, in this unprecedented dilemma, we want to make sure that we're keeping our kids safe, our teachers safe, and our principals and all our staff safe. We also want to make sure that we are educating our kids because we don't have years to lose or days to lose. So I'm really thrilled to have Dr. King and Dr. Sanalisis on today to talk about public schools more broadly and about public education broadly, and also about thoughts on what's going on here in Maryland. I think, you know, unquestionably, I think leadership at the top of our country has led us to be in a place where we're not as safe as we could or should be right now. We haven't prioritized enough our kids, our country being in a safe enough place for everybody to feel comfortable having a child in school. And so I'm excited to hear some thoughts on what's happening around the country, thoughts on how we can reimagine our public school system based on what we're learning today. So I'm gonna kick it over to Dr. John King to start with. Dr. John King is the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool through college. He served in President Obama's cabinet as the 10th US Secretary of Education. And in tapping him to lead the US Department of Education, President Obama called King an exceptionally talented educator, citing his commitment to preparing every child for success and his lifelong dedication to education as a teacher, principal, and leader of schools and school systems. And if you aren't familiar with Dr. King, I highly encourage you to read more about him and follow him. He's an amazing life story and is a great thinker and leader in public education. So I'm excited to turn it over to you to start us off, and then we'll go to Dr. Santelises. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Brooke, for your bringing this all together and for your leadership in Annapolis on education equity issues. So maybe I'd frame where we are, continuing your theme that this crisis has really revealed and exacerbated long-standing inequities in education. And the crisis has had a disparate impact on low-income communities and communities of color. There's a disparate health impact where we know Black and Latino folks are 3 times as likely to get COVID, twice as likely to die from COVID if they have it. There's been a disparate economic impact from the COVID crisis that has fallen particularly hard on low-income communities and communities of color. But there are also real disparities in the educational impact of the crisis. And we see that at every level. One, we went to online learning overnight, and we already had a digital divide. And so low-income students and students of color were less likely to have a device and less likely to have internet access. And having a device means every kid having a device to be able to work at home simultaneously. It's not just a device in the house, but it's a device for learning. Right? And then internet access, we know that about 79% of white families have reliable internet access, 66% of African-American families, and 61% of Latino families. So huge gap in access to the internet. And that's not just a bandwidth problem, like we often see in rural communities and some high needs urban communities, but it's also a cable company problem. That some cable companies say, well, you can't have the internet if you have an unpaid balance. Well, that's barring the schoolhouse door for kids. And so we saw that problem through this spring. We saw that districts with less resources had a harder time providing professional development and support to their teachers around online learning. And we all know, certainly all of us who are parents, my kids are going into 9th and 12th grade here in Montgomery County Public Schools. All of us who are parents realize school is not just Zoom. You can't just say, well, I'm gonna do everything I did at school on Zoom and have that work for kids, right? But school districts really struggle to support their teachers around distance learning. We also saw disparate levels of parents' ability to support their kids with at-home learning. Only about 1 in 5 African Americans in the workforce can work from home. Only about 1 in 6 Latinos in the workforce can work from home. And so folks weren't in a position to support their kids. Many kids were actually, older kids were taking care of younger siblings at home. And so we know there was a disparate impact educationally. And we also know there was a disparate impact socio-emotionally. Kids who were in homes where there was economic trauma, where there were health crises because of COVID, kids who are in homes where there's abuse or addiction, those kids were isolated. And I worry a lot about that. I was a kid. I lost my mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The thing that saved me was school, this place that was nurturing and reliable and consistent and supportive. And it would have been a disaster for me not to have school. And so my heart breaks for the kids who lost those relationships with teachers and peers throughout the spring. So the consequence, academic loss. There's a recent study by McKinsey that showed an average of 7 months of learning loss for students, 9 months for Latino students, 10 months for African American students, socio-emotional loss. And now we come to this next school year, and we're in this, and I'm sure Sonia will talk to this, that we're in this political mess that's been created by the failure of the current administration to address the pandemic. I did an event a few weeks ago with the Minister of Education of Finland. In Finland, they already opened schools. They had 2 weeks of school before summer break, but they were able to do that because they had the pandemic under control. The administration has failed at every level. We don't have clear public health commitments from the federal level around masks. We allowed people to open before they should. We chose bars and restaurants over school for our kids. We don't have testing and contact tracing still. And this, as you know, is not just a national problem. It's still, despite the publicity, it is also still a Maryland problem. We don't have the testing and contact tracing we need, and we don't have the commitment to quarantine. And for folks who are low income, sometimes really hard to have someone who's sick at home not be interacting with the other people who live at home. What if you have 5 people in an apartment? And so other countries have invested resources to make it possible for folks to be quarantined so they could get control of the pandemic. We didn't do any of those things. So the consequence now is we're having this false debate. Should schools reopen? Well, the real question is, can society get its act together to get the pandemic under control? That is prerequisite. Then we've got to have the resources for schools to do the things necessary to be safe, from personal protective equipment to changing transportation schedules to improving ventilation. Congress still hasn't acted on the resources that schools need. Governor Hogan vetoed the Kerwin blueprint, so sent a message, we're not going to invest in schools because of this crisis, which is exactly the wrong instinct. And so here we are, all of that falling on schools. And so I'm totally supportive that in Montgomery County has decided to start virtual. They're going to assess how the public health situation evolves to decide when they can move to hybrid, focusing first on the students in transition years and students who are particularly vulnerable. Of course, that's where we are because of the societal situation we're in because of the failure of the federal government.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true, right? If we really have failed and to prioritize our kids, to make sure that we were in a place where we didn't have to have a debate about, reopening or, having some kids in schools or not. We don't have that leadership at the federal level, and I would also say we don't have it at the state level, frankly, right now. So it's very frustrating, to be sure. But I'm thrilled to also welcome Dr. Stanilisas to make a few remarks and talk for a few minutes. And then we had a number of questions sent in that were really great questions about, both the future of public education more broadly and how this has helped us to learn about teaching and education and different options, and about, of course, sort of this debate and dilemma over, where are we and what do we do next? So thrilled to welcome the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, Dr. Stanilisas. She is a partner. She spent close to 30 years focused on building high quality teaching and learning to help students excel. She first came to City Schools as the Chief Academic Officer from 2010 to 2013, and then she returned in 2016 after 3 years at the Education Trust, which is, of course, where Dr. King is now. So Dr. Stanilisas came to Baltimore in 2010 from Boston, where she was the Assistant Superintendent for a network of 23 pilot schools with broad autonomy and a track record of successfully meeting students' needs and improving the achievement of low-income students, particularly students of color. And she lived in Baltimore with her husband and 3 daughters since 2010. So I'd imagine you've done a little bit of teaching those 3 daughters. I've done quite a bit of teaching first grade, which I'm not great at, and I don't have the patience for. So my son is really not excited about another semester with mom, but anyway, and I will say, for those of you who don't know, my son attends our local public school, Hampstead Hill, and we've had a great experience, and we're big fans of City Schools and of the work that Dr. Stanilisas and our teachers and principals do. So Dr. Stanilisas, I'm thrilled to have you here today. I know you have both of you have very busy schedules, but thanks for taking some time to talk with us. And I'll turn it over to you for a few comments. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Delegate Lehrman. It's great to be on the call with 2 education champions and advocates with long histories of supporting public education. And I have to say, This is a time where we absolutely need that. So I want to thank both you and John for your continued work. Actually, I think this is my first time seeing you this week, John. There are some weeks where I see John like daily because we're on calls together.
Quite right, quite right.
And this is the first time this week. And my apologies for being a bit delayed, but I was talking with board members about, of course, a question that's on everybody's mind about how are we opening, in what context. And it was actually really helpful to come in and hear John setting the much larger context that really does emphasize, and it's not, believe me, an absolution of responsibility, but I think what was so heartening in a really wild way in terms of some of John's context setting is that this really is a situation where there are no great choices, right? That there are no great choices, and there's absolutely the real concern within Baltimore City that a lot of the disproportionality of impact that we see nationwide with the virus is also true in our own city. But it is also true that for those same families and those same families' children, there is also disproportionate vulnerability for long-term education loss. And I know Delegate Learman, you may not mind me saying this, but in our last briefing for elected officials, you actually asked that question, which I loved. And you actually said, you know, what do we know about the learning loss? And I think we heard in some of John's references, some of the things we are living right now. And, you know, I don't need to, but I could tell you 100 stories of, you know, young people for whom school is that connection point, that now has been, if not severed in some cases, at least severely weakened in terms of the distance between what they were receiving in school and out of school. Not that everything, let's be clear, we always had students that we needed to do a better job reaching, and I've been very forthright about that. I think the challenge of this moment is actually expanding that band of children, right, that need more. We always had children who needed more. Now we're going to have even more children. So, you know, one of the stories that has stayed with me has been, you know, a 6th grade, you know, honor student, young African-American boy in one of our schools here, who was advanced in math. When the pandemic hit, his grandmother, you know, was unable, you know, she's not easily mobile. And so he went for 3 weeks. Her cell phone was turned off because of some of what John was referencing about, you know, our negotiations with Comcast and carriers. And yes, like any good caretaker, she's going to prioritize home and food before she prioritizes a cell phone bill. Cell phone went out, was totally disconnected to what was the information that was being presented virtually. And that young person 3 weeks later finally got a Chromebook to be connected to what was going on. Now, does that young person cease to be a math honors student, right? Because he was disconnected for 3 weeks. That potential doesn't go away. That prior achievement doesn't go away. But if we don't acknowledge that there's some ground that we have to really focus in on making, then I don't think we have the full import and impact of this decision making we're in the middle of. The piece I will say for all the Baltimore folks is yes, we are in the throes of the decision making on a daily basis. Our original plan, which many people know now, was to offer families a choice of whether they wanted an all virtual option or a hybrid in-person option that would help us thin out the numbers as the health is guiding us to do. But with a lot of the shifts that are occurring now, you know, we too are considering an all virtual opening. And so I'm in the middle of discussing some of that, what that will look like. But I think the bottom line is this point about preparation and the preparation we need to do that we've begun to do. We're not for, you know, my option is not to just say, okay, now we have to give up on 6 months of this school year and that there's nothing we can do, right? We have summer school, a small band of schools that was all volunteer, teachers and principals. No one was drafted to do anything, who said, we want to be part of figuring out how this can look in physical school buildings. And let's start with some of our young people who we know have been most impacted by this time away from school. And so our summer programming opened, and I do have pictures of students with masks on, sitting in city schools with marked 6 feet. We had a little controversy, John, here in Baltimore City. People were saying that I recommended we do less than 6 feet, not the American Academy of Pediatrics who did it. So we made sure it was 6 feet so that everybody would be fine. And young people and teachers were there. And so I think the question has to turn to, one, what do we need to have in place in order to bring students back safely in Baltimore City and across the country? And two, what are the ways that we can prepare and gradually go there, right? Like, it doesn't have to be tomorrow if our community and our staff aren't ready for it to be tomorrow. But it also should not be that we kind of hunker down and do nothing. And I think one of, with all of the kind of, less than constructive comments that I get across my email, I will say that we've had some fabulous ideas from teachers about ways to still engage with young people better than we did in the spring, now that we have runway and time to prepare. What are the ways we can bring small groups of students back in ways that people are more comfortable with and build our knowledge? But second, this piece, and everybody knows, with regards to funding, Baltimore City was already chronically underfunded even before COVID broke. If you look now, and I use this one example, we know our operations team did some work analyzing some of our old, and we know we have older buildings, but just the air quality, because we know with regards to circulation, ventilation. Well, we were making the decision, I made the decision to say, yes, in order to keep families safe and staff safe, we need to invest in filters that, by the way, were not previously budgeted, right? So we didn't have a slush fund waiting for the day a pandemic hit. Well, the cost of upgrading all of the filters in already, right, aged school buildings, right, just to be able to have filters to make sure that the air circulation is right with regards to preventing COVID infection is a $2.6 million additional expense within the budget, just for the prioritized 86 schools that we know need it most, right? So that doesn't include our 21st century schools. So when we talk about that, and we talk about personal protective equipment, well, the good news is in Baltimore City, we didn't have any controversy among families or staff about the need for everyone to wear masks. So I'm thankful that in Baltimore, we don't have to have that debate. Well, but behind that then is the cost of what does it take to have clean, viable masks every day for every student that comes through the door. And that in and of itself is yet another expense. So when we talk about the cost, and I think, John was right, when we talk about the cost of opening, this is not just, I had a very well-meaning and intentioned member of the business community say, well, can't you just shift all the expenses that you weren't using during the shutdown to this? And I said, well, we didn't lay people off, right? We still had to keep buildings, operating. And so there's not just this magical pot of money that's sitting there, and we really have to have conversations about where the priority of opening up school well fall within our community and within our country. And you're right, John, like I did laugh at the fact that, and again, I think people should be able to make a living. I have nothing against bars or nail salons. I wish I could go more often than I do. But the reality is we made a decision to open there and spend so much more time and attention on opening those up when we actually could have also been devoting attention to what is it going to take to actually lift schools up as well. So I will stop there.
Yep.
And then, turn it back to you, Brooke.
Thank you. No, I mean, I think you raised a lot of really important points that a lot of people, I'm sure, on this, who are watching this are grappling with, right? The idea that we have priority, we hear from perhaps Governor Hogan, who talks a lot more about, our employment, bars and restaurants, perhaps, than about what is happening with our school system. And I think we've seen a real lack of leadership from MSDE. I mean, I'm not just saying that, I think that's factual, right? MIT did a study showing that we've had less leadership in terms of standards and whatnot. So, but there were quite a few questions that moved away from the reopening or not, and towards sort of how we see this moment being used to redesign schools as we knew them, to include the community, to reduce class size, to expose children. Like, what are things that we can take away or that we can learn from when we have this space where, not just in education, but in many parts of our economy, it seems like we can't waste this opportunity to start thinking bigger or to think differently. And of course, in Maryland, it was incredibly frustrating that the blueprint, that the governor vetoed the blueprint for Maryland's future. And I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to override that veto and fund our schools in an equitable way. But I'm curious to hear if you've been hearing from folks around the country or leaders, throughout the state and others on, what we should be taking from this. Are there things we can be learning? Either of you? A few people asked that, what good can come of this, right, in the long run, basically? How can we redesign schools? How can we rethink what we do?
Well, I'm going to ask Dr. Santelises to start, because we've been together on a panel with this question. I know she has some good examples from Baltimore City of how teaching and learning has gone that I think would be useful for her to share, and then I'll add.
Fair enough. Thanks, John. No, actually, and John is right. I think actually one of the silver linings to this whole kind of challenging moment that we're in have been some of the ways that it's allowed us to think differently about teaching and learning, and how we make sure that more of our young people are actually having access to the kind of learning and experiences that we want them to. So one of the things that this period provided us the opportunity to do, and it'll actually serve as a partial update for John because he's heard earlier iterations of this. But one of the things we were able to do as we were looking into all of these virtual classrooms is begin to see teachers who actually really flourished in this environment and who were able, regardless of the zip code of their student, were able to garner a whole lot of engagement. They were teaching new material. One of my favorites, Ms. Fort, who, by the way, John, is a teacher leader this summer, providing support for her colleagues. And Ms. Ford is a great example because she was teaching 5th grade math at Cecil Elementary, started with her class. Principal could see just how well she was doing. She started teaching all of the 5th grade at Cecil, then went to teaching 5th grade across 9 or 10 schools within her community learning network. And the power in that for us as we were beginning to build it out was this consideration of differentiated roles for teachers and how do we get some of our most effective and most skilled teachers in front of the students, connected to the students that need that high quality teaching the most. And it was in this virtual environment that we were able to use technology in ways, frankly, we had not thought about it before. And so part of what we're asking as we plan things like how are we going to assess students' learning when they re-enter school, how are we going to make sure that we're giving them access to some of that additional support, we're actually using some of the learning from that model to say, how do we organize differently, what the interactions are between different teachers in different roles. And it's had a great impact in, again, rethinking what were the things that we weren't as successful as we wanted to be before the pandemic. How do we use that now? And then one other small example that I think this one kept me up for at least a week or two afterwards, and that is our young people who are part of Eager Street Academy, which many folks may know is our school for incarcerated youth in Baltimore City. We had 20 students there who, during this distance period, engaged and enrolled in 2 online classes at the University of Baltimore, and collectively had one of the highest GPAs in those 2 college level courses at University of Baltimore, across all of city schools. And when we spoke with those young people, they were very clear that it was the most excited about learning they had been, sad to say, through almost 12 years plus school in Baltimore City, right? And these were our young people, some of our target population, and I could not help, as happy as I was, I couldn't help thinking, perhaps if we had actually had this kind of learning experience for them earlier, they might not need to be sitting at Eager Street in the first place. And so it's really pushed our understanding and our, the way that we do our work to think about how do we bring more of those opportunities using distance learning to be able to do that. So I do think that there have been a whole bunch of things that have been opened up as possibilities in this space where things are kind of, not as normal, that really could inform a new normal if we don't just automatically revert back to, well, this is how we've always done it. This is how we need to continue to do it. So I think that's our push.
Right. Thanks. John, Dr. King, did you have any other? Did you want to add?
Yeah, just the one thing I'd add, that's amazing, and I love the work that Dr. Sedelices has been doing and that Baltimore City educators have been doing. The one thing I would add is that I do think this moment has caused us to look at the issue of student agency differently, and the need to help students learn to set goals for themselves, manage their time, ask questions when they need help, act on feedback from their teacher. There's a way in which to make distance learning work well. You have to rely on students managing themselves differently. And we ought to learn from that students can do that. We ought to be doing more of that when we get back to school, whether it's distance or hybrid or in person. We ought to take advantage of students' ability to set goals for themselves and pursue and structure their own learning.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And of course, I mean, I think there's also, I know some of the people on the Zoom call, I don't know everybody who's watching on Facebook Live, but there's a real difference in perspective too for our children who are young, right? Our kindergartners, our first graders, versus our high school students and versus our college students. And we are going to have a whole webinar on college and our public universities at the end of the month. And we're going to be talking with teachers next week. But, I'm curious too, there are a couple questions about, the difference between, and are there different tactics needed and different lessons needed or different approaches needed for our, our youngest learners versus our high school, junior high and high school learners, and how do we work with both of those different age groups? Any thoughts?
Yes, I think for us, we recognize the prioritization of getting our younger students back earlier because of the interaction that's needed. I will say this. One of the kind of case-making challenges, we were struggling with some folks earlier was the need to be able to combine absolute academic skills with developmentally appropriate kinds of activities for young people, namely play, right? And oftentimes there's this dichotomy that is made between young people, for example, learning how to read and having space to play. And I think one of the things within this setting is we have had far more partners who have been able to join with us in helping to provide some of those learning opportunities that are much more activity-based for younger students, that have caused us to think, well, we actually probably could have been leveraging these resources beyond just summer programming. We should have been leveraging them all along. And so I do think at that end of the spectrum for us, there's definitely that need. And then our career exposure, right? Like we are doing far more because, again, it's virtual, because we have additional partners on the career exposure space for our middle grade students, right? That it doesn't have to be an either or. It's not either you are enrolled in your algebra course or you get to learn about a different division of manufacturing and engineering. You actually can do both. We can leverage both. And again, I think this time period has really kind of brought a lot of that to the forefront for us.
Yep, that makes sense. There are also a couple questions about funding, of course, and so I think it's worth it to talk about money. Like I said earlier, the governor vetoed the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Our schools are already inequitably funded, and certainly we needed additional funding before this, and we certainly continue to need that additional funding going forward. There's also a concern about, there were a couple questions of how would a decrease in enrollment affect funding in the future? Some of my friends are looking at homeschooling or talking, for the next few years. Do you think it's likely the federal government may pass legislation to provide more support to education during the COVID crisis? How does what's happening right now affect school resources and the need for additional money, and where would that money be deployed within our school system? So sort of a host of financial questions, and I'll let you two sort of pick how you want to respond, but I think there are concerns about the money, and there are great things that we can do, but we need the money to do them. So
that's right. And I think the governor used the COVID-19 crisis as an excuse to do what he probably was always going to do, which is to veto the blueprint because of an unwillingness to make the necessary long-term investments in education. He even, as you know, vetoed the revenue enhancements that would have allowed there to be more resources to pay for Kerwin. So, it's a bit disingenuous, but the reality is, I think, the legislature will have an opportunity to override and should, and we need to commit the long-term investment in our kids that ultimately will allow our economy to thrive and produce a lot more revenue over the long run. So that's the state level issue. That at the federal level, I am hopeful that over the next few weeks, Congress will act on a stimulus bill, and that will translate into significant resources to do two things. One, address the hit to state and local revenue as a result of the COVID-19 economic crisis, to stabilize budgets. That's important for public K-12 education. It's also important for public higher education. And then two, set aside targeted resources to address the things we need for a safe opening of school, which includes the masks that Dr. Simfelisis was describing, but also ventilation improvements, changes to transportation, and so forth to make opening work. We also need targeted money to address learning loss, so we can have more intensive tutoring, potentially an extended school year for kids who are behind. We need targeted money for socio-emotional needs, like school counselors and mental health services. And then we need targeted funding for bandwidth, internet access. Now, Congress hopefully will do all of those things. The House has already committed investments there, but we need the Senate to step up and make a similar commitment. But I am hopeful, because I think there is a realization that states and local government, they can't borrow, and the federal government can. So in a time of economic crisis, we really need the federal government to step up.
Yep.
Well, and I would just add, I was glad John went first, because I was going to say he's the person who has his ear to the ground. I've been watching from a distance, hoping that shift is occurring on the federal level. So that's very encouraging. And locally, I would say, some of there absolutely is the blueprint for success that, we really advocated for, asked for, pushed for. I also think it is about rethinking what we prioritize and how we distribute. So it's really interesting that one of the questions that I get a lot that was at least in the chat is about, how are we making sure that each school has what it needs with regards to hand sanitizer, soap, PPE, all of those. And within city schools, we have a long tradition of school-based budgeting. And one of the things that we made the decision to do was not necessarily suspend school-based budgeting, but to say there are some of these expenses that are kind of bottom line health expenses that we're going to have to take responsibility for centrally, right? So
Right.
I remember when the virus was beginning to pick up speed, and I was actually, John, I was with you in Cambridge again, and I was ducking in and out of a meeting because we knew it was building. And, one of the big decisions was, well, schools had it in their budget and they didn't order enough, and at some point you had to say, okay, scratch that. Everybody needs to have soap, put it to the side, and let's streamline around what those critical expenses are. So one of the things for us that has benefited has been kind of the clear articulation of priorities helps in times like this to then be able to say, okay, now we've got to shift those priorities. We had not prioritized very forthrightly district-wide purchasing of devices, of Chromebooks or of laptops. That was not our priority. We had put it other places in terms of curriculum and other things. Well, that was a clear shift of what might have been 9 or 10 on the list that suddenly became 1 on the list. And how do we organize our work so that we can do that? So I do think it's a both and I do think it is about absolutely more money and equity within funding, but it is also, and I see a former board member on the call, Cheryl Kashani, who when she was on the board was one of the things I always appreciated about Cheryl's leadership is she was very quick to say, yes, we need more, but what are you doing with what we have, Sonia? And I think that it really is a combination of both. And I owe it to the public to be able to communicate how we are making those exchanges so that when more money does come, and I'm being very hopeful that it will, that we use it well and we can communicate out well what those assurances are so that when I get a chat question from, a parent saying, can you guarantee my child's school is going to have soap? We should be able to say yes, right? And that should not be up for grabs.
Right. Yep. No, I think that makes sense. There were a number of questions about special ed. And actually early on in this, I hosted a webinar with a special ed attorney and a special ed counselor who, work with students to talk with parents about strategies. And, I'm curious. So there were a number of questions, both about if parents of young children and parents are going to be responsible for educating, how will we train the parents? And then also questions about if parents of special ed students, how are you going to help the parents to help their kids? And what will the role be of, of teachers working with special ed students and what are, their obligations and how do they meet them? It's, obviously a challenge, and I'm curious at what thoughts or practices around, either around the country or around the state that you have seen that might show some promise and ideas and thoughts for that now.
Yeah, so a few observations. One, around the country, one encouraging thing is that I do think school districts were very creative in trying to get services to students. Everything from physical therapy provided via Zoom to teachers doing reading instruction for dyslexic students, one-on-one or in small groups, again, via online learning, or districts that sent folks out to do home visits to provide support at home in a physically distant, safe way, but making sure that kids got services. So that was really important. We're going to need to do that again this school year. 2, some services were really hard to provide that way. Some kids did not get the services they should have this spring. and they are entitled to compensatory services. That is, they're entitled when they come back to school to get the supports they need. The hard thing for school districts is an environment of constrained resources. People are really scared of the level of obligation they will have to kids to provide those compensatory services. The solution to that is federal money. Right? We ought to see significant federal stimulus dollars targeted to school districts, particularly for students with disabilities, that will then allow them to provide those compensatory services when we get back to school. Then the third piece is, I do think the parent support piece that you raised is just so crucial. And one of the lessons of this spring is how much support parents need to help their kids when they're learning in a distance or hybrid learning way. We did polling at Trust of parents around the country. And again, we heard a desire from parents for more communication with their child's teacher, more tech support around using the technology, and more strategies for supporting their kids. This was true for all students, but it's particularly true for parents of kids with disabilities. You know, and it's not just the support to help your kid, but it's also the support you need. For some parents whose kids have immense challenges and they're struggling to support them, they need not only educational support for their kid, they need personal support as well. Someone to talk through what they're going through, a parent support group, access to telemental health, right? And so I think as a society, the question is, what kind of society do we want to be? What kinds of supports do we want to have for kids and families that are most vulnerable? And in the wealthiest country in the world, we ought to be able to support all of our kids and their families.
Yep.
So I was definitely taking also some notes as John was talking so that I could make sure I follow up on a few things. I will say we tried to be very forthright, meeting with families early about making sure that we documented what compensatory services they were going to need. We weren't trying to kind of smooth something under the cover. We weren't trying to shirk our responsibility, but really having kind of a forthright conversation about that. So that was first, and we have what we termed kind of individual distance learning plans that were there to cover the gap between March, when we closed, and the end of the school year. I do think this piece around a different relationship with parents, right? We've always talked about with families that they need to be partners in the schooling and they're part of it. Well, we all discovered that is an immediate need for the foreseeable future in ways that I don't think we ever really imagined would look like they do. And so one of the, I think another silver lining to this pandemic from an educator standpoint, and one principal said it best to me. She said, you know what, Dr. S., there is no professional development I could have given my teachers about how much most parents really care about their kids than I did through this crisis, right? Teachers were able to say, actually, having regular conversations with parents is what I should have been doing all along in this environment, right? Being able to check in on how the learning was progressing. We know from our own survey data that an overwhelming majority of parents, 83%, reported teachers checked in with them. They had contact from their child's school. I think the transition, though, that we also saw in the data was the large numbers of families of students with disabilities and families of English language learners who said they needed a different kind of support. And so in our design for the fall, we are really trying to give kind of a hard look at how do we do that better, right? Because, you know, I will say Baltimore City, like a lot of communities, really rallied around teachers in schools this spring, but it is also with the understanding that, again, it needs to look different in the fall. Like, we're not expecting the same thing. And so part of what we're doing in that is being far more explicit in planning what the family training needs to be, the family development and support needs to be to prepare for an upcoming school year that, whether it's hybrid or 100% virtual, we know is going to rely on distance learning. So that's a huge learning for us.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's 2:51 and I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I promised to get you off by 3. So I think we'll, close it out soon with some closing comments, and hopefully Dr. Santelises, in your closing comments, if you could just let folks know when final decisions are due. I think that would be helpful for people to know, whatever the decision is. I think it's early August, but it would be great if you could let folks know that. But I do think, I want to thank both of you. This is an ongoing conversation, of course, and, this is a really challenging time in our country and in our communities. And one piece that we didn't get to that I do want to lift up and highlight is the role of community schools. And that I have seen on the ground the importance of community schools. And that was a very important part of the blueprint, is funding our schools as community schools. Now, for those of you who don't know, just one example is in Highlandtown, where we have a large number of Spanish speakers and Spanish speaking students. All the community school coordinators who work with the students, and the work that they did to get food resources out and health resources out, and just to be the point of contact for families who didn't know. And I'm sure I know it's like that all over the city. It's certainly like that in Cherry Hill and Lakeland in my district, and Brooklyn and everywhere. And we've had weekly calls now with community school coordinators in my district. And it's amazing. It's important for us as elected officials to have them to talk to know what's going on in the community. And it's important for us to have them to send information to them to get out to their families. So I think one of the things that has been really highlighted for me during this is just the importance of really capable community school coordinators and principals and teachers, to be connected to their communities when their family members might not know how else to get access to resources, whether that's testing or food or rental support. I think that's such an important piece that we always knew was an important piece to support students, and has become even more critical in this time as well. But huge decisions that need to be made, and with huge repercussions for our students who are already facing great challenges. So I'll turn it over to you for sort of some a couple final comments on where we are and the future of public schools broadly, and what we can learn and take away from this. Dr. King, do you want to start?
Sure. Look, I think this is a crossroads moment for the country and the state, right? And so I taught high school social studies, so you'll have to forgive the historical analogy, but when we had the Great Depression, the country looked in the mirror and said, we don't want to be a country where people starve in the street. We don't want to be a country where we abandon people in a time of crisis. And so the New Deal reflected a decision to be a more caring and resilient society, right? And the New Deal gave us things like Social Security, right? We had the Tennessee Valley Authority to make sure that folks in rural communities had access to electricity. Just as today we need access to the internet because it's vital to navigate society. So that New Deal moment ought to be how we think about this moment. We ought to come out of this moment with a much deeper commitment to early childhood education. If Congress doesn't come up with $50 billion plus for early childhood, we are looking at the collapse of early childhood care throughout the country. We ought to come out with a much bigger commitment to investing in K-12. We need something like Kerwin so that we build the foundation for a long-term equitable economic recovery. We ought to make the social policy choices to make sure that people can't starve, that we have adequate food benefits, that we have adequate access to health care, that folks can take a sick day if they're sick, that they can have paid leave if they need to take care of a family member who's sick. Those are all choices we can make as a society about how we treat each other. And I hope this is a moment where we step forward. And I look forward to working with you to make sure we do that in Maryland and continuing to work at a trust to make sure that we do that nationally.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Sanalisis?
Yes, I actually thought John should close with a larger, more national view of the future, because after that I wanted to just say yes, absolutely. For a little closer to home for Baltimore City, our final plan is due to the state around how we're going to do opening by August 14th, I believe. We have committed to make sure that the community knows as soon as possible. So we have a board meeting on July 28th. And we will be making sure that by that board meeting, we have a full proposal that takes into account what the current conditions are, but also a lot of the phasing that I think we're seeing in many jurisdictions across the country and across the state. So the community should stay tuned to that. I was on a call with national urban superintendents this morning, and a number of districts are finding themselves in similar places because, again, as we noted earlier, we don't have the national control of the crisis yet. And so because of that, people should look for phasing, but some definitive decisions about opening of school will be out very shortly by July 28th at the latest.
Great, thank you for that. There are a number of people who were chatting me. Please tell me, when are we gonna know?
And it might be earlier, but
yeah, well, it's good. But thank you both for all your work on this. I know that you have many sleepless nights trying to figure out, what we can do. And Dr. Kane, I appreciate your synopsis of this as our New Deal moment at the federal level. And I think it is, frankly, at the state level too. We have the opportunity to decide if we are going to build an equitable economy moving forward. And the only way we can do that is to invest in education today. So I appreciate all your comments. And as the mom of a second grader, incoming second grader, will be awaiting decisions too. And as a delegate who represents, a number of phenomenal schools, amazing principals, amazing teachers, and parents and families. It's such an honor to get to work with both of you. And thank you everybody for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and take care. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.